So the place I work at is called the Mersey Tobeatic Research Institute, and it's named after a body of water as well as a wilderness area located in southwest Nova Scotia, but we're about 10 minutes from Kedji-Makujik National Park. Our work is across the province, but there's a lot of species at risk in southwest Nova Scotia, which is also known as Gascoic in Mi'kmaq. And our main job is we're trying to conserve biodiversity, and so that might look like working on a particular species at risk, like bats, but also we're focused on habitats as well, and that can be anything from a whole growth forest to a wetland, and a lot of that is involving private landowners, because that's where our land base is in the province. And the way that we operate is we're focused on research-based decision-making, so we want to be doing studies to understand what's going on in these habitats and with these species at risk to make decisions on how to better protect them and hopefully maybe one day even not be at risk. And so we're working with the values of our partners, that might be through an Indigenous lens or the community as well, to figure out the best way to do that. And so here's a picture of some of our projects, but I'm going to talk about bats. Next slide. So bats are significant for a number of reasons, but the thing we like to think about is like the economic impact. So when we lost bats in the eastern part of Canada and the US, someone did a study in the eastern part of the US and found that it was just under $27 billion that has been spent more or lost from bats disappearing. And so what this actually tied to is bats just naturally provide pesticide control. And so when we lose bats, we're spending way more money to control those insect populations. And so we had around a 31% increase in pesticide use in the eastern United States when that happened. And so I don't have a number for you in Canada, but it's just crazy to think about the health impacts on us and our families and generations to come on that heavy pesticide use. I like to think about the insect impact the most because all our bats in Canada rely on insects to eat, but across the world we have insects that are pollinators and seed dispersers, and we get a lot of benefits from those. I'm going to show you in a little bit, not quite yet, some of the foods that we're connected to with these bats. They also have a lot of significance with their things we've learned from bats scientifically, medically, and culturally. I like to think of when the military is developing sonar technology in the 50s, they were consulting and paying bat biologists to study bats for war, of course, but we've learned a lot about echolocation and sound and how it works, and we've used that for military technology. There's also a lot of cool things medicinally and culturally. When I watch Disney movies, it's amazing how many Disney movies, if you're watching those kids, actually have bats in the background. Medicinally, I like to think about, I'm going to have another slide, bats don't age traditionally in the way that we do, so it's really hard to figure out how old they are, and they can live for a really long time for their body size. So we learned a lot from them on aging and are curious why they live so long. As well as vampire bats, they have this they have these properties in their blood that prevents clogging, and so they've been researching that to find out how we could potentially help stroke patients. And so I'm just mentioning some of those examples because bats have really been a big part of research, and humans have benefited a lot from them. I guess go to the next slide. So although we don't have bats here that pollinate and seed disperse, we have food here that you probably ate today or you've ate this week that is thanks to bats. So bats are either controlling insects that eat those plants and those fruits that you like to eat, or they're dispersing their seeds for pollinating them. So great examples are bananas. They're pollinating the fruit for bananas. For insects, they're controlling insects on coffee bean plants. And so it's amazing to think that some of our food here today is we can thank bats for. Next slide. The other thing I like to point out is we have a different relationship with bats compared to other animals. So if we think of birds, we could go outside right now, we could see a bird, but it'd be pretty far for us to go outside and find bats right now. And so we have a different relationship, and I think it gives a lot of mystery because they're out at night. We're not good at seeing in the dark. And they're picking spots to protect themselves that are kind of dark and hidden, like an attic or a cave or a mine. And those places are a little bit nerve-wracking to us. And so I think that's shifted our relationship to being like, ooh, they're kind of creepy, but they're just trying to protect themselves, and they just have skills that we don't, where they can see in the dark, essentially. And I think that's led to a lot of the folklore and superstition around them and this fear around disease, just because we don't have these daytime personal interactions with bats, especially like we used to 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so this man here, his name is Merlin Tuttle. He's one of the most famous bat people in the world. So if you look up bat stuff, you'll probably come across him. And I think his book title, The Secret Lives of Bats, really speaks to this mystery. And so he's describing them, like all the wonderful things he learns about them from like a 50+ year. I might even have like a 70-year career of studying bats. I'm at year 10. And yeah, so if you wanted to learn more about bats, I highly suggest his book. He's also done some podcast interviews. If you're a podcast person, there's one called Ologies. You can generally find these free online if you want to listen to him. He has such inspiring stories about learning about bats. Next slide. The last thing I want to point out that makes bats special is that they're just very different from other animals. So they've been on the planet much longer than us. For over 50 million years is the estimate based on fossils that we found. The aging part that I talked about earlier, this isn't the normal case. We normally can't tell a young bat from an old bat, but this picture is a bit obvious. You can see this one below has got some gray hair and things like that. And the one above is fresh-faced, I guess. We don't actually have this species of bat here, but it's really hard to find cases where we can actually age them. So if you were to give me a bat right now that was 5 years old or 10 years old or 20 years old, I wouldn't be able to tell you the difference in the age. So very cool that they can live that long. The other thing I'll point out from this list of some of my favorite things about them is that they spend most of their life upside down, which is quite unique from other animals. Like imagine hanging upside down for like 15 to 20 to 23 hours a day. Like that's amazing. So now we'll get into the bat species in Nova Scotia. A lot of people don't realize that we actually have, so we've had 7 species documented here. I'm going to talk about 6 because the 7th one we've only seen a handful of times. But it is really cool to think about that we do have that diversity here and that people are like surprised by that there's actually so many. So I'll start off with the first set. These ones are small, little, and brown. These are our most common bats historically. The first one we have is the little brown myotis. It is small, little, and brown. The next one we have pictured here, the northern myotis. It's also called northern long-eared bat. It has longer ears than the little brown bat. The third one pictured here is the tricolor bat. This one, it's really hard to tell, but every individual hair has 3 colors on it, so that's why it's called tricolor. So if I was to like pull the hairs back, it would look like a bad hair dye job. And so they're all small, little, and brown. And they're hard to differentiate, so you need a bit more expertise. So if you were to see one of these bats flying around, you wouldn't probably have any confidence in which one you saw. But you're more likely to see these ones because they're relatively more common than some of the other bats I'm going to show you. So in the past, we had estimates that there was potentially tens of thousands of these bats here in Nova Scotia, and then, ooh, that was scary. It's my work laptop. Yeah. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Maybe I'll tilt this back. So what groups these bats is not only were they historically the most common here, they're present in the province year-round. So you're going to find them here during the summer when it's nice weather. They're beginning to come out of hibernation now. You can see there's good weather. But during the winter, what they're going to do to survive is they're going to hunker down in a cave or a mine in Nova Scotia. And so that gives them a safe, stable environment to make it through the winter when there's no bugs, water's frozen, they don't have access to resources. And so they conserve energy by basically, they're not going to sleep, but that's a good way to describe it. So they do true hibernation, and they can look a little lifeless when that's the case, but that's their strategy for making it through our cold winters. During the summer, if you find a group of bats, that's actually a group of female moms getting together to raise their young. So if you've ever had a colony of bats growing up in like your grandparents' house or your house when you were younger, those were female mom bats and their young trying to raise them. Because bats that are male of these species, they actually like to roost alone and they're not involved in childcare during the summer. So. One important thing to think about with these bats that's maybe different than birds is that they use a network of sites, so they're not just relying on one tree or one building. They require like an area of connectivity and multiple roosts, so that on the hot days they're picking a cooler roost, and then on the cold days they're picking a warmer spot. And these bats are all listed. They were assessed in 2013, and then they've been protected a couple years later. And so they've been affected by white nose syndrome. And so what's different with this set of species here, these ones are not as common, but these ones are affected by wind turbines. And so I'll highlight the different species we have here. These ones are a bit easier to tell. If you saw one at Lantz or you got a photo, you have a chance. The first one is called hoary bat. Hoary actually is described because they have white frosted tips on their hair and they have a bit of a yellow face. They're the largest bat we have in Canada. They're about twice the size of the other bats on the other slides. So instead of weighing a toonie, they could weigh 2 toonies. The other bat here is silver-haired bat. Really great. It actually has silver hair on its back and the rest of it's black. And then probably the easiest bat to ID out of all of these bats we have in Nova Scotia is the eastern red bat. And so if you were to see it, it's distinctly red. We have less records of these bats in Nova Scotia. We have more monitoring to do to figure out how common they are, but they're here during the summer because what they're going to do during the winter when it gets cold here is they're going to leave. We probably have some family members that do that as well, and so that's their choice. And we tend to see them a bit more often when they're migrating. They're just moving all over the place a little bit more. But that's also where they encounter more wind farms. So as we're building more wind turbines and wind farms, and they're trying to go down south to southern United States or Central America, they're encountering more and more wind farms and dying. And so there's something called the green-green dilemma when we're trying to do these green technologies that potentially help the planet. Sometimes it's affecting our efforts with other conservation and other wildlife. And so there's been a lot of work between industry and bat biologists to figure out how we do wind farms that support bats and don't harm them and don't kill them off to the point where they're recommended to be listed as endangered federally. Where do bats live? Well, it depends on which bat species I just showed you. They live in different spots. Some bats are really versatile and some bats are not versatile. The great thing though is that all of you have woodlots, and the next slide is going to show you which bats you can find where. So all our bat species I just showed you, they're all forest-dependent species, and so that would be their primary choice. Just some bat species have evolved to use buildings as well over the years. And so on the next slide, if it comes up, you can see which species you could potentially find where, but if you look at the natural roost, you'll see that applies to all the bats that we have here. And so one thing I like to point out is that when we look at who's using buildings and bat houses, we're supporting one bat species, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just important to think about if you put up a bat house, that can be a great conservation action and maybe potentially make it easier to look for bats, but that natural roosts are really where it's at with supporting bat populations and helping them, especially when they're experiencing threats from wind farms and Wayno syndrome. And then, as you can see, our migratory bats are not here. They're migrating and then hibernators. You can go to the next slide. You were ready. I was too slow. So with those two threats, I'm probably, maybe someday I'll be helping advocate for bats with wind farms. The disease that's here, that's established, that's spreading to Western Canada now. You might be hearing in the news in a couple of years bat populations may decline in BC. The fungus has taken the last 15 years to spread there. Usually when it arrives to a cave or a hibernation site or bat populations, it usually kills off about 30% the first winter or two, and then usually up to 70% of bat populations by the second winter. So it's just the impact on bats is really, really quick once this fungus gets to an area where those bats haven't been exposed to it and they're hibernating. I do like to think of these bottom threats that we have: habitat loss, pesticide use, human disturbance, and then as well as our, what pets we have that can disturb wildlife. I think us as individuals, or maybe potentially if you have a woodlot, we have a bit more impact or control over these threats, so we can think about what chemicals we're applying, how we can potentially support habitat for these bats with natural roosts, as well as if we have control over keeping our pets away from wildlife and not disturbing bats. I think those are some of the things we have a bit more impact on. The next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the survey methods we're using to figure out actually how bats are doing in Nova Scotia, and so that's one of the questions we get asked the most, is how are bats doing? I'm going to share with you the results of 3 techniques. So the first one, we count bats at their summer roosts, so those are those groups of those moms with their kids having babies, and those are the most important sites because those are going to bring back bat populations if we protect those summer roosts in buildings and trees, depending on the species. We're also recording their vocal activities. They're using sound monitors called acoustic recorders, also done for birds to figure out what bats are around. And then some researcher partners at the University of Waterloo are also catching bats. So next slide, I'm going to share with you the results of when we've been working with private landowners as well as some bat roosts on Crown land. I only have the data up here for roosts on private land. Each different color on the right-hand side here represents a different landowner that we've been working with. And so some landowners we've been working with over 5 years, and we've done multiple bat surveys where we go out to their barn or their attic, and we see how many bats they have over the years. Generally, those people are having more bats, so that's been really exciting. People are asking how they're doing, and all these landowners are happy to have them. They often have them in a barn where it's not causing any coexistence issues for them. But through this data, it looks like we're seeing more bats at the same roost from year to year. And so when people ask how they're doing, they usually say, a small number of sites we're seeing more bats. So I think this is a promising result, and hopefully we continue to find more sites like this where bats can be supported, have their young, and eventually bounce back. Next slide. So this is some results. I have 2 projects I'll show you the results for the sound recordings of their voices. So we monitored 11 sites in southwest Nova Scotia, Gaspowick, for 5 different years for 1 week across 5 different years. And we repeated the monitoring each year, and then we looked at which species we were detecting. Across all those years, we generally saw for all the types of bats more activity. But some bat species are better at recording their voices. Some bats have fainter voices and they're harder to record. But for little brown bat and tricolor bat and hoary bat, we're generally seeing more vocal activity from them year to year, which maybe means that those bats are persisting on the landscape and that they're potentially increasing. We can't tell, though, from acoustic recordings how many bats there are. So it's hard to say if it actually is more individuals or just more of the same bat making the same sound. But promising nonetheless that we're getting a bit more bat activity through sound recordings. You might be interested in our fire impact study. So the last work was with Wassahopa First Nation Wildcat down just near Greenfield in Southwest. This was done in partnership with Nova Scotia DNR on the next slide. We actually had data collected at the Barrington burn site before the fire happened, and so then we re-recorded at that site after the burn to look at if bats were more active at the burn site before and after. And what we found was bat activity increased within the burn site after the fire. It also increased at 2 sites nearby. So you can see S20 and S18, which are 2 sites we studied as well at the same time that are located near the Barrington fire. And what we found is bat activity increased from before the fire to after, so more bats, but we saw a bigger increase in bat activity at the burn site. And so when we look at other studies, we find that bats sometimes increase at these sites because the nutrient cycling and the creation of more snags and dead trees can benefit bats and give them more habitat, potentially roosten, and more nutrient cycling, which brings more insects. And so there's a bit of connectivity there of the impact of fire that can potentially be good for bats short term. We don't know if that actually benefits bats long term, and may be potentially good for like certain species over others. So for example, one of the migratory bats likes to roost in leaves, and so this is probably not great for them, but maybe for some of the other species. The last project results were done by the University of Waterloo. So they went and captured bats before the disease whiteness syndrome came in at caves and mines in Nova Scotia. Some of you may know that within half an hour from here is the largest hibernation site for bats in the province. Some of you probably grew up, so I imagine some of you have been there. And what these bat researchers are doing are going back and netting for bats and putting up a net and capturing bats to see if we're catching the same amount or more. And what we're finding is that depending on the species, they all generally have declined significantly. So this data is even capturing bats up into the last few years. Researchers have been there. But some species are doing worse than others. And so the little brown bat, the one that's the most versatile, using bat boxes, buildings, forests, etc., that one declined significantly, but not quite as bad as the northern lanier, which is a forest-dependent species. And so we haven't seen that bat basically rebound since the fungus, unfortunately. The tricolor bat was never numerous before. So when we would capture bats, only about 4% of them would be the tricolor bat before. We're actually seeing a little bit more of them now, in contrast to the ratios. But yeah, I think the takeaway from some of these surveys now, before white nose syndrome came and harmed bats to after, is that bats are still here. So some species might be affected worse by this disease and these threats, versus some seem to be kind of coming back and managing to respond. Though to contextualize all this, it's important to think about bats can't respond to a 90 to 100% decline within 15 years, so we're not expecting bat populations to rebound 15 years after something like that happens. They only have 1 baby per year for most species, And so if you want to think about recovery and potentially seeing bats again like we used to, it's going to be decades probably before we could ever see bat populations like they once were. And maybe they will never go back to the way that they were. So how can you help? You can go 2 slides ahead. I was like, wait, if I can. So you can go to the next slide after this one. So one thing that, maybe share something you learned today. Some of you actually probably know quite a bit about bats. You would have grown up with bats being very common. You probably have some really good bat stories for me, which I would love to hear. I think just letting people know that they're, like, some of the misconceptions are just like not true. I've been out with bats at night for the past 10 years and I've never had one in my hair. I'm not saying they won't do that, but at this point I think it would have happened when like 1,000 bats are flying around you. So I know that I've maybe talked to like one person in the past 10 years where that's happened to them. Where that's true, please let me talk to them so I can find out more about it. So maybe just letting people know the truth about bats, that they're incredibly important for natural pest control. We have all these different species and that they're really quite different from other animals. So I think that makes them pretty special. If you ever want to, like if you're looking for bats and you want to know more, some people haven't seen bats in a while, so they're just not as familiar with like what they sound like, what their guano looks like, what they look like. Sometimes you see a bat really quick and you can be unsure if it was a bird or not, and so feel free to reach out to me. I love photos, I love talking about bats, and so I can help you if you think you maybe saw a bat or might have them on your property. One thing you can do is support bat-friendly spaces. There's things like really supporting healthy insect populations is going to benefit bats, so turning off your lights at night, planting native plants, reducing pesticide use if you can, and keeping your pets away from wildlife. Some people say give your cats a curfew. There's a few different things you can do. I know it's hard once your cat's outdoors. I grew up with an outdoor cat, but the other thing is I like people to report their sightings. So on the next slide, I have reports from the past month. We've gotten 5 reports of bats in the last 24 hours. I just checked this afternoon. And so people are starting to see them come out of hibernation now. So it's that time of year. All the animals are kind of emerging from making it through the winter. I didn't have any bat reports for here. Lantz is the last name, not the place, in the second photo. There is about 10 bat reports for like this immediate area where people reported the town as Lantz. But of course there's a whole bunch of bat sightings in this general area due to some of the caves and mines. Other ways that you can help bats, we have some new beneficial management practices. A lot of these are quite consistent with some things you've probably heard about for birds. The only thing is bats require a network of trees versus like birds are nesting potentially in one tree, but bats need a network of those. So I'd say that's one difference, but them to keep in mind. The photos we saw this morning though of the snags and the trees with like cavities and things like that, those are great trees for bats. And I even just talked to someone this afternoon who said, I've seen bats in trees before, and that's amazing to think about. So if you're curious about some of those practices, these resources are available online at our website. And if you have a hard time finding them, I can email them to you as well. The next slide shows the last resource in a bit more detail. If you're curious about what tree species bats like, more specifically about forestry practices that help bats, so they like mature trees, large diameter trees, cavities and crevices. If you're kind of curious more about the specifics for each of those species, this is a longer document where you can look up the individual bat, what they like, and then if you want to keep an eye out for those features, they're in there. We currently don't have a ton of photos yet, so we'll work on that, but this is the first resource specific to Nova Scotia that's been developed like this. The next page just shows the summary table from this document if you're curious about tree species and features and all these good things that you might be curious about looking for when you're out in the woods. And then I have my last slide. So I have my email up there if you ever want to reach out or if you see a bat. I would love to hear from you. Even if you're seeing a bat multiple times, it's great to have records of where people are seeing bats now because it's so rare too. And yeah, I think I can take questions. Yeah.